Today, we're diving into how systems of misconduct manage to protect themselves. And we're going to use a pretty well-known case, not to rehash the scandal, but to really understand a much bigger and honestly more unsettling phenomenon, what we're calling the architecture of silence.
So let's just start with this idea right here, because it's at the very heart of everything we're about to talk about. Power without accountability becomes protection. This isn't just some abstract phrase. It's literally the blueprint for the entire system we're going to break down.
So yeah, let's dig into that metaphor, an architecture of silence. I want you to imagine silence not as just nothing, not an absence of noise, but as a physical structure, something that is actively, deliberately built and then carefully maintained brick by brick, specifically to shield wrongdoing from the light.
To really get our heads around this architecture, we are going to use the Epstein case as a lens. Now, the goal here is not to get bogged down in the specifics of that scandal. Instead, we're using it as a case study for a much larger systemic problem, one that you'll find pops up in all sorts of institutions and contexts.
So what is an architecture of silence? Well, think of it like this. It's a system where massive amounts of power, wealth, and social connections create this kind of protective bubble. And inside that bubble, terrible behavior isn't just hidden, it can actually start to feel normal, which makes it almost impossible for any real consequences to get through.
To figure out how a structure like this even gets built, we first have to look at its blueprints. What are the core, foundational elements that allow this kind of silence to take root and grow? It all starts with power and authority. Okay, so there's this key psychological driver at play here, and it's something called authority bias. It's basically a mental shortcut we all have. We're just wired to trust and believe people we see as being in charge or having high status. We automatically assume what they say and do is more credible.
And this is exactly how that bias gets weaponized. You create this veneer of prestige, access to powerful people, huge amounts of wealth, big public acts of charity. It all creates this psychological curtain. It makes awful actions seem less plausible, and it makes everyone around hesitant to ask the hard questions. I mean, if all these important people are involved, it must be okay, right? And this creates a huge conflict at the institutional level. On one side, you've got this immense pressure to protect the image, managing reputations, keeping loyalty networks intact, fearing the consequences of a scandal. But on the other side, you have what the institution is supposed to be doing, upholding integrity and demanding accountability. When image wins out, that architecture of silence gets another steel beam put in place.
So let's move on to the next part of this blueprint. We've seen how power shapes the system from the top down, but why do the individuals inside that system so often just stay quiet? This gets us into the psychology of inaction.
A really critical idea here is the diffusion of responsibility. To put it simply, it's the someone else will deal with it effect. The more people who are aware of a problem, the less personal responsibility each individual feels to actually do something about it.
And in a network just filled to the brim with powerful, influential people, this effect becomes incredibly strong. Everyone just assumes that someone closer to the action, or someone with more authority, or, just someone else will be the one to finally step up. And that shared belief allows inaction to just spread like a virus through the entire system.
And you can see how this becomes contagious, right? It starts with an act of misconduct. Then, the key insiders, they stay silent. Maybe out of fear, maybe because of that diffusion of responsibility we just talked about. Then, others see that silence. That's a powerful psychological cue called social proof. They basically conclude that staying quiet is the expected and frankly safer thing to do. And before you know it, silence is an exception. It's the norm.
So when a structure like this, built on silence and fear, finally, inevitably, crumbles under the weight of the truth, what is the ultimate lesson? What are we supposed to take away from watching it all fall apart?
So, what is the one, single, most important lesson here?
The crucial takeaway is this. The real lesson isn't about the shocking details of any one scandal. It's about becoming aware of the mechanics of psychological control, about understanding how fear and authority and our own mental biases can be manipulated to build a system that does one thing really well: protect the powerful.
And that brings us full circle. Because when you strip away all the complexities, all the names and places, you are left with this one fundamental truth. Power without those checks and balances, it isn't passive. It actively works to build itself into a fortress, a shield for the people who wield it.
So what does this all mean for us? Well, the final takeaway isn't really about pointing fingers. It's about learning to recognize these patterns in the world around us, and it's about understanding the profound and often difficult need for individual moral courage, the courage to ask the uncomfortable questions, to speak up, and to resist an architecture that's specifically designed to keep us all silent.